I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Imrit. The first thing I want to talk about is, so if you think about the sky, right? You look at the sky, and it gets cloudy and it changes, but the actual sky itself is more or less stable, right? It changes color at night, comes with a more or less similar color during the day. And if we think about that, and we think about the colors we see in the sky, we might all agree that they have a similar color, right? There might be not a big disagreement between us humans about the color of the sky. But if you think about why there's no disagreement, this comes to something Imre has already mentioned. It is that we are all designed more or less the same way, especially our senses and the way we perceive. There might be difference. Some of us might have interesting differences like synesthetes that might have some sort of mixing up of the senses, and we may have some differences, but in general, we're pretty much the same. But if you take a bee, right, and we could imagine, or we could design a way to see the sky as a bee sees the sky, right? We know that they see a much broader spectrum of light, and because of that, their sky is different to our sky. So the Rayleigh dispersions, the physical phenomenon, the Rayleigh dispersions that cause the color of the sky, for the bee are actually creating a violet-like sky, not a blue sky, right? And because of this sort of phenomenon, we might think that maybe just because of that, the bee might have just a different experience about the world and a different concept, right? Maybe a lot of what we believe to be important or cognitively relevant about blue would not be as important to us because the sky would be of a different color, right? So it might not be as soothing or as important to generate creativity or any of these other sort of cognitive effects that blue has, just because the sky would be of a different color. So my first message today is, definitely, our body determines our reality. How you feel through your senses is what really moves and changes what you think and what you believe and so many other things. And if we start from that, we say, okay, that's interesting. We know the body's important. And it makes us wonder, well, what is reality, actually, right? Is it just that it's what we all agree on? Is it what I perceive? Is it what I can imagine? Where does reality end or start, right? And with interfaces, then, it's a bit trickier, right? We can change reality, we can enhance it, we can alter it, we can transform it. So we're hacking in some way that experience we have already with these interfaces. So it already changes the meaning of reality all the time. If we think like a bat, right? So bats, they have an amazing sonar. We're studying it in neuroscience more and more. It's fantastic. And it's so good that this world of ours, that for us might be a world of colors, is actually a world of sound for the bat, right? And if there was a bat flying here in this room, he would be able to see what is behind this wall without peeking, right? Because of the waves, the mechanical waves that travel and come back. So they could see the density behind this, and they could build a completely different spatial map to the one we have, and the way of doing it would be different. So reality is tricky. Reality is not a stable thing, is not a stable concept, and we should treat it as such, as a volatile mix of, in one way, experiences, but also of opportunities to create and to hack what we believe to be what we are, who we are, and why we are that. And when we come to that, and I promise this is the only kind of weird, strange thing I'm going to show you today, and then, right, it just looks like pasta, or what happens to your headphones when you string them, or you just put them in the bag and it's like messy. Well, I think evolution loves messy, stringy things. This is like a receptor. And so the first interface that ever existed was a receptor. Before there were neurons connecting to each other, many things, there were receptors. It's a pretty complex receptor, but it is one of the most ancient ones, called the NMDA receptor. And what is interesting about this is that it was the first interface because it was the first way an organism could in some way know something about the world. Where something electromagnetic, like light, or mechanical, like motion or touch, it was this receptor. And so fundamentally, a body like ours is just an accumulation of those experiences, of those receptors. And what we do is just kind of gather that, harvest it in some way, and organize it. So the more complex the organism, the more layers of organization we have, of this process of organizing or structuring that. And what I want to talk about is how, through this very basic, simple element, which is the receptor, we end up having the most amazing experiences and the most diverse behaviors, which I don't even have to give you examples. As the species we know, right? From art, film, to science, to all these things. They're all based in our ability to understand the world and our craving or want to understand it even more, right? So the first thing I want to talk about is how science has changed so much in the last 100 years, and how we've come closer and closer to understanding that sensory experience is a mix. It's an interesting mix. It is a mix that, in a lot of ways, defines what we can believe on, but especially that these senses are always communicating with each other. They're always talking to each other, and they're always creating, some way or another, what we consider a single unitary reality, right? And so we can actually convey a taste with a color, or we can convey a smell with a texture. We can, and the brain can actually swipe one for the other, say, right? So if I ask you which is sweeter, something green or something red, most of us would agree that something red might be sweeter than something green, right? And the question we're trying to answer is why, right? Because we all agree on it, but why does it happen, and why? I think the importance is obvious. The more we understand how everything works, the easier it is to design things, from products to experiences to interfaces to stories, right? If we imagine at some point we could just tell a whole story just with colors and textures, and everyone would understand the same thing and get the same idea, or draw the same thing, the same picture, something like that. So the more we understand how these exchanges come across, or how they work, which are called cross-modal correspondences, the easier it will be for us to create or to provide some sort of predictive information in the environment for people, right? Whereas is the taste of a product or the flavor of a product, right? Or something more important, like where there is danger, or why is that more relevant or less relevant in a web page. So many different things. So it becomes important. So it's not about what kind of interface, but that this should be incorporated to any interface we're thinking of, especially complex interfaces like games and computers and video games and packaging, right? Product packaging is, in a way, an interface. It is so valuable that companies spend at even 80% of the entire cost of producing a product. It's just the packaging of it. So what are we really drinking? What are we really eating? What are we really putting on our skin? Is it just the cream there, or the ice cream, or the chocolate? Or is it something more just complicated, which is the texture and the weight and the shape and the sound and all these other things that are coming together? And we start looking at this. There's so many visual elements that we know about, like roundness and symmetry and seriality, or the number of elements in a figure, or how large it is, right? All these things can also be transformed into other senses, or in a way, at least, thought of in other senses. And you can see it in products, right? We know that carbonation is more angular and spikier than something sweet or something smooth and soft, as well as something crunchier, especially, or at least in Western cultures, with some exemptions around the world, but not very many of them so far. Although we do need to test more countries, because we keep testing the same people over and over. But we're getting there. We're working on that. So this is interesting, because somehow, through a process of almost artificial selection in our cultures and in our countries, we've extinguished all those products that don't meet this. You can't find products that are very strange and that break these rules too much. They don't exist. Even if we didn't know how this worked. They just kind of die out faster and faster now, because we're more globalized and competition is so fierce. And if we talk about taste, which is one of the main topics today, one of the things we're going to talk about, the first thing I would like you to think about is, what is taste, really? After what we've talked and how our bodies, in some way, limit and also provide all the possibilities for our experience. And why do we end up liking what we like, right? You have a friend next to you, and you tell them, well, my favorite thing is taking chocolate fudge and eating bacon with it. And they're like, you're crazy, right? But then they tell you what they like, and they're just as crazy as you are. So why do you like that? Why do you find those combinations? What is the opportunity you have there to create in some way? And the more you think about it, the more we understand that taste is a multiplicity of senses, right? We think of taste maybe color, obviously the chemicals on whatever we're eating, obviously the smell that goes up to our nose, but how about the texture? So if you take an ultrasonic gun, right, and you fire it at a piece of fish, salmon for example, at something like 40,000 kilohertz, and then you blindfold people and you give it to them and they eat it, they might think it's pork, might think it's chicken, some of them might think it's fish, but really they're just guessing. You don't know. But if you think about the difference between pork, chicken, and fish, you'd say, I never confuse them. Never. But texture becomes so important in that experience that it is part of taste. It is part of what we consider to be our taste experience, what we call flavor, right? Something more complicated. And then we have all these opportunities to think about interfaces. We think, well, it's so hard to be in an online interface and create an experience of taste, because how do you get that chemical in it? But could we provide at least partial experience of taste with the texture, with the temperature, with the vibration, so many things? Could the brain be able to imagine more or less a taste or the texture of clothing without being there? And I think Mariana is going to talk a little bit more about that, so I'm not going to go into that, and she's going to show you some really cool stuff. But my message here is, taste is so much more. So when you're at home thinking of impressing someone when you're cooking something, or you're just tired of eating out, or you're just hungry, it happens, right? You want to think not only about what you're putting in terms of the recipe and the ingredients, but what else is there, right? What is that interaction that your body is having with your reality out there? What are those colors? What is the weight of the cutlery? How big is the plate? What color is the plate, right? What does it look like? What do you think about it? And play with it. And I think one of the reasons why we hate cooking is because it's so boring the way we do it. If we think that a book could be an interface too, so far the books we have to cook are terrible in general. Right? They just give you a recipe and they say, go, this is like a blueprint. Go build this blueprint and eat it. I find it terribly boring to do that. But if you think of it more like the way you choose what music you like, and how you might build a playlist in Spotify or iTunes, you just keep listening to things and you just drag them. And you say, well, this kind of works with this and this, and you have no sort of remorse doing it, right? Because you're afraid that, well, you can't just mix anything in food, right? But why not? And we're always thinking, well, it's just whether it tastes good or not, and we just think taste is this, if it tastes like fish, it's fine because it's fish, and if it doesn't, well, don't eat it. But the opportunities we have to create tastier and at least more fun food for ourselves and for others is immense. And if we think about interfaces, imagine the possibility of creating interfaces that would teach us not really to cook, but to enjoy food. To sort of shut down some of the senses that are maybe overwhelming our experiences and telling us this is what you should be believing and feeling and thinking about it. And you could shut them down a little bit. So you would be forced to just smell or taste with your mouth or feel the texture of food. The potential is huge, I think. And maybe it might actually change our habits and our perspective on what we eat and how often we eat it. So one of the big challenges is, how do we get people to eat more insects so we can grow insects, which is so cheap and so massively effective, instead of eating so much meat or other things that produce so much deforestation in the world every year, right? An insect, imagine how much food you have to feed a ton like a ton of meat from an insect versus the same ton of cow or pig or chicken, right? And they're so clean too, insects. We don't think so, but they are. The keratin in their bodies nothing sticks to it. It's really hard. They live in our filth, but in general they're very clean. But it's really hard to get Westerners to say, yeah, here's a mealworm, go for it. And whoa, right? But if we could change that, right? If we could, imagine we had a virtual reality helmet and we could think it tastes just like chicken. That'd be awesome. It'd fix so many problems. You'd say, well, the virtual reality helmet is expensive. Well, maybe, but it's so expensive to keep living this way. So one way or the other, we're bound to fix something or change something. So either because we're forced to or because we actually realize we can't keep going this way. And if we think a little bit about how we end up choosing what we like and what we don't like, it could, yes, be a mixture of genes. It could also be a mix of our experiences, right, with things and what emotions we adhere to these experiences. But it's also about what we believe. It's funny, but it's true, right? If you're a baby and they give you insects from the beginning, well, you can't complain. Maybe you get used to it. Maybe you never like it. But your beliefs will be different, right? So cultures that have, at least in an ancestral way, had eaten some insects may be more propense to say, fine, well, it's not the same insect I had when I was a kid, but it's still one. It might be easier. But if we've never had an interaction with them, we might freak out. So what we like is not just guided by that interaction, but also what we think about the interaction between the body and the world. And I think with interfaces, that is also interesting, because the more we play with that experience, the more prone we are to accept it. And just going to the kitchen and just, I don't know, opening a cereal that is actually full of grasshoppers might not be very fun. So we have to think about it, and I think interfaces play an important role there as well. But if we go beyond that, if we think about the emotions that we attach or that are sort of in some way associated to our sensory experiences, they also have a sensory component. So you're sitting down in a movie, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment. You're sitting down in a movie, and you get scared. You feel things, right? It's not only that you feel things in terms of like, oh, I have an emotion like surging in me. You feel things, right? Like your chest. You feel, right? You may be sweaty, or just there are bodily experiences going on there. And that also comes to touch, right? We feel things. We feel emotions in our bodies as well. And it's interesting because maybe those associations we have about certain emotions and how they're triggered in our bodies may also explain why we may prefer some things, or why we may associate some flavors or some experiences in smell and taste in a particular way and in another way, right? So maybe if I'm really scared at some point, or I have this sort of visceral experience because I'm angry or because of some other thing, I might attach that to my experience of taste or my experience of smell or something else. And then I start to build on this, and it becomes a much more complicated network. So I always think that film is an amazing space to start changing taste and smell and touch, because most of us like them, right? It's like no one says, please don't force me to go to the movies, I hate it. Some people might say it, but in general, all of us, or most of us, like it. We may not like the same films, but we like the experience. So we already have an interesting experience there, and it produces emotions, it gives you an audiovisual experience, so there's a huge potential there again to think, well, could you watch a movie that goes better with Ben & Jerry's ice cream of a specific flavor, and then would you love the movie more? And vice versa, could you watch something that makes you try and eat something that you've never liked and love it? Just like when you go to a concert, and you see this group that you might like them, but you don't really adore them, you don't love them. But after the concert, you kind of end up liking them so much more. You might even start listening to them on a daily basis, just because the multisensory experience might have given you much better emotions than the ones that you started off with, right? So I think there's an interesting potential there to use what we already have as interfaces and use them in a more creative, or in a different way, not more creative. And I want to invite you, so you may have a chocolate lying there somewhere. And I want to show you how we can play with these senses and hack them a little bit. So what I'm going to do is, if you break the chocolate in two pieces, if you haven't eaten it already. Have you all eaten it already? Okay, well, that was my bad. I should have told you, don't eat the chocolate. So I guess the experiment was to change the flavor, but now the experiment was to see how impulsive you were. But I would have done the same thing, by the way. Sorry. I'm just going to keep going now. But so the idea with this was, and I'm very sorry, I wanted to change the taste of your chocolate. So the idea was that I was going to give you two sounds. And so this is a more or less traditional experiment in the field now, where you eat the chocolate, you listen to a low-pitched sound, 80 hertz frequency with some variations, and you eat it, and you say, well, maybe it's a bit bitter, it's a bit chunkier, right? And then you eat the other one, and you have this high-pitched, happy sound, right? And then you eat it, and you say, it's a bit sweeter, it's a bit more intense, and softer, smoother, right? And what the literature tells us, and what science is telling us so far is, well, this happens because we associate, or in some way match, the low pitch with bitterness and the high pitch with sweetness, right? But I also think, and this is something I want to sort of convey today, is that maybe it's not that, because the more we do it, and we've done it maybe with 1,000 people now, it's also related to how you chew the chocolate. And it seems that you can actually influence the way you respond, how your actions are sort of deployed in the world, just with sound. You can change how someone moves their hand, or how fast they row, or how hard they run, or what's the rhythm of running that a runner has, right? Just with the sound. And so that is interesting, because imagine the potential we have in an interface to guide behavior, for example, in a restaurant or in your homes, with just music. So I can see a world where we have Spotify playlists designed by brands and by scientists, where you might say buy a Lindt chocolate, and you go into your Spotify or into Last.fm or something, and you find the Lindt playlist, right? And it says, well, for those lovers of bitterness, you go into that and you play that music while you eat your chocolate, and it tastes fantastic and you love it, right? And then someone else might say, well, I'm not super keen in eating dark chocolate. I like it, but not so much, but I want to learn how to like it more. And you might choose a different song that might help you with that. Or you may want to listen to music that while you do a sport or while you run, that not only is pleasing, but maybe helps you be a better runner, helps with your posture, makes you faster, makes you stronger. There are interesting enhancements we can think of. I'm not saying it's limitless and we need to do more studies, definitely. But I think that we've given it less attention than it deserves. We just think, oh yeah, it's nice, you pair this with this, and it's sweet, and you pair this with that, and it's bitter. But I think it has to do with our bodies more. It has to do with how we're hacking this interface. It is the original interface, which is our body. And the potential that interface has to being hacked better and more. So we can have more fun, or be healthier, or be faster, or just make our friends like us more, be like, oh, that's awesome, they have this song, and right, you have something to talk about. So I think there is a huge potential there for sure. And let's see if this moves great. And it makes you wonder whether when you smile while you eat, or when you watch a movie while you're eating, right, is the movie congruent with your food experience? Is your reality, or the reality you're building, congruent with a pleasing and pleasurable eating experience? Do you think maybe the food you eat while you watch TV will taste worse, or you might not like it as much, or you might eat more than you should because you're watching TV, right? Do you think that maybe the emotions you feel might also influence how well you take care of yourself, how much you think about the food you're eating, and how conscious you are about how good that food is? And the final experiment we're doing now with Maria, who's sitting right there, is we're trying to change how we perceive the intensity and taste itself with just changes in how we express our emotions. So we asked people to make different faces, and more we've found that people can, to a degree, change their perception of taste just by changing their emotion. Not even the emotion itself, just the face you make while you taste something. And that's interesting because it's telling us something important. Our bodies are not just an expression mechanism towards the outside, but they're a place where the brain finishes processing information to help them understand it, to expand their cognition, our cognition. And I say it's cognition because we're just basically a little part of our brain, right? So it's interesting because then this outside of us is part of the brain in some way. And it's so much easier to hack this that it could go drill a hole in there and say, we're just going to implant some electrodes and it's going to be fun. How many of you would raise your hand to do that one, right? The chocolate was like, ooh, chocolate, great. But what if I said, oh, it's another way of doing it. Don't worry about it. We'll just drill a little hole there in your temporal cortex and we can do the same experiment. And then everyone's just going to run out here and be like, those crazy Oxford scientists. So there is a huge potential to use the body as a interface and as a medium to hack our experience instead of thinking, well, let's get into the brain, yes. But this is the brain too. I don't think the brain differentiator cares much what we think about the body. I think he thinks it owns everything, and it's done, right? And the body, we think of the body as this outside system, but it's also an inside system, right? Our visceral experiences are clearly there. Very quickly. So I think smell is one of the senses you can tamper most with, in the sense, if you're remembering something very vivid, very powerful, you might almost be tempted to think that you're smelling something from that situation, right? Or if you're thinking of something very disgusting or bad, you might actually say, well, whoa, there's a moment there where you almost think you're smelling something, right? And so far, interfaces have tried to play with the actual experience we have, at least via helmets and tablets and things like that. But the first cinematographers were thinking about tampering with the structure of things, with the rules of things, so that you would believe something else. And if you can bring specific memories in people, if you can play with what they feel and then create a whole story, they might actually smell something different. Or they might believe they're smelling something different. You might tamper with it. And smell is very susceptible because it's very primitive, and it's very much tied to the systems that process emotion and that help us understand emotion. So that's just a thought and the potential it has also for interfaces. Sometimes we don't actually have to influence those receptors themselves, but the processing of the information from those receptors. And just to finish now, there's a whole school that began in the 19th century called the aesthetic physiologists that thought that the line was the simplest form of expression. And if we think about it, all our facial expressions, all our information, and even our sensory experiences could be translated into very simple visual forms, into very simple things that we could then tell different stories. Some of you might see a face there, some of you might see just something going up, some of you might see different things. But we could, in some way, translate this to many things, and brands know it, and they've been doing it over and over, and it's very effective. We're doing another study with Maria, and she found 168 brands that use some sort of human feature in their logos. And that, how many countries was it?
35.
35 countries, so brands in 35 countries. So there seems to be a tendency, they seem to be doing very well, actually. And if you look at, for example, this, Avengers, right? How many of you saw both of them? So maybe no one, great. So, but if you ever watch them, I'm not saying they're great, my film taste is terrible, but if you ever watch them, think about which one lasts longer. And you'll find this very tricky. You'll think that this one, the last one, is longer than the first one. But I strongly believe that the reason is because of the emotions that it makes you feel. This one's much grimmer, much darker. And even the main sort of villain has this very sort of grim voice. This one is almost 15 minutes shorter, but you think it's almost like 40 minutes longer. And I think it's about how you can break the structure of time by how you perceive things and how you feel things. There's also huge potential there. From waiting in line to actually tailoring good experiences for movies. So we did something like that. And well, where are we going? And we measured people's engagement to films. And then we correlated that to how much money they made. And we found that definitely there was a connection between how short I felt the movie was, how much I engaged with it, what emotions I felt with it, and how how much they were connected in some way or another to this movie, right? And it's great, I think, because you could use this for anything, right? You could test an interface with this. You could predict how well a series or a film is going to do in a given time or moment. This is a bit old because we did it a long time ago, but you get the idea. This could be, I don't know, Game of Thrones and whatever's on, like, hype right now. So there's a huge potential to think about this. So it's not only about designing the interface, but thinking, well, how do we insert content into this interface that you can hack or that you can use to create a better experience, and finally, to design a much better experience for the future, right? To keep measuring and to keep analyzing it. After all, we're scientists and we want to know not only how things are working, but how we could do them better. I think that's all the time I have. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed it.